Corporations in the form of railroad companies loomed very large on the political landscape of the last third of the 19th century. Part of this had to do with the growing legal protections of corporations. In 1886, there was a lawsuit involving the Southern Pacific Railroad in California. So the state government introduced a law that stipulated that companies could not deduct debts when assessing the value of their property for the purposes of taxation. Remember that railroad companies carried large amounts of debt, and this was a way of offsetting their tax burden. The Southern Pacific took the case to court, arguing that it was not fair that individual citizens could deduct debts for the purposes of taxation, but not corporations. And the company's lawyers argued this was a violation of the 14th Amendment, which stipulated that all persons should receive equal treatment under the law. And the argument was that a corporation was a legal person. And it turns out the Supreme Court upheld the Southern Pacific's argument, which enshrined the legal standing of corporations as legal persons, and thereby offered them a measure of protection against public regulation. So the provisions of the Bill of Rights, which had been originally designed for individual citizens, protection against unlawful search and seizure, guarantees of due process of law, the freedom of speech, are now extended to corporations such as railroad companies. Now, at the same time that these corporations are developing a protective armor that shields them against the intervention of governments, they're also developing a new form of business organization that economic historian Alfred Chandler has referred to as managerial capitalism. So this new form of business organization, Chandler argues, arose from the logistical challenge of managing an industry that is continental in scale, that involves tens of thousands of employees, that involves carrying millions of passengers, millions of tons of freight. The companies required heavy investment and maintenance in roads, rails, tunnels, bridges, tight organization of rolling stock, passenger and freight arrangements, maintaining schedules, filling out services, maintaining inventory, and mobilizing capital and handing money and income and outlays. So this is a logistical challenge that had never been seen before, with the exception of the Army, and it's kind of telling that a lot of the early managers of these railroad companies came out of military academies. So these companies are not merely family partnerships. They're not run by individual entrepreneurs. They're modern business organizations. They're the first companies to have a large cadre of salaried managers. They're the first to have a central office. They're the first to build a large internal organizational structure with carefully defined lines of responsibility, and the first to develop financial and statistical flows to control and evaluate the work of many managers. Now, one of the characteristics of these large corporations is that they tend to not like competition. They tend to monopolize a particular railway route, and once they've done so, this allows them to set the prices they like, set the freight rates they like, and set the wages that they like. So contrary to the ideals of the free market, these large business organizations now have an unprecedented monopoly power, and this leads to a lot of consternation in American society. A lot of people are fretting about the fact that these corporations, or trusts as they called them, seem to represent a new form of concentration of power, concentration of both political power and economic power. And scandals such as the Credit Mobilier scandal seem to confirm the danger that these large corporations represent to republicanism and to democracy. This posed a real challenge to how Americans understood the relationship of work to citizenship. Since the time of Thomas Jefferson, the prevailing belief was that the self-sufficient farmer, the yeoman farmer, was the ideal citizen because he owned his own property and developed the virtue that came from reaping the rewards of his own labor. And this was possible in an agrarian society in which land was relatively equally divided between white men. And this had been the belief of the Republican Party in the 1850s. They rallied around the slogan of free labor, free soil, and free men. So in other words, freedom was associated with access to land and the dignity that this access provided to the working man. But now in the late 19th century, a period of growing inequality that Mark Twain referred to as the Gilded Age, they saw a growing divide between the holders of capital, the shareholders of railroads and other corporations, and the great mass of laborers who typically did not own any property and were forced to make a living through earning wages. And for those who came of age with the values of the Republican Party, this was an indignity, a kind of wage slavery that affronted their sense that they ought to be able to control their own destiny through the ownership of property, and that their own hard work would be a source of social advancement. So now labor was no longer associated with freedom. To the contrary, to work rather than to earn wealth through capital investment was a kind of servility, a kind of bondage. And while Thomas Jefferson at the beginning of the 19th century had talked about an aristocracy of talent, as he put it, a political leadership that won their positions through merit, by the last 2 decades of the 19th century, wealthy Americans increasingly gravitated towards the social Darwinism of Herbert Spencer, who argued that human beings, like other animals, were defined by, quote, the survival of the fittest, and the wealthy owed their position to a kind of genetic inherited superiority. And so we come back to the question I posed at the beginning of this lecture, which was why the strikers in 1877 were so willing to use violence in order to advance their cause, and why the counter-reaction on the part of the political and economic elite was so extreme. So this was not merely a labor conflict about wages. It was a conflict in which the striking workers saw their very independence as citizens as being under siege, while the political elite saw the workers as posing a mortal danger to the existing social order. What if they stopped working? What effect would that have on their economic empire? And many at the time saw the stakes of this battle and emphasized the growing divide between the wealthy few and the toiling many. So when strikes broke out in Albany, New York in the summer of 1877, one of the strike organizers, a guy by the name of John Van Hosen, argued against violence but also emphasized the dangers of a society in which the wealthy lived in abundance while the workers struggled to feed themselves. As Van Hosen put in a speech that was published in the Albany Argus, he said, "Who is this Vanderbilt?" So Vanderbilt, I should explain, was referring to Cornelius Vanderbilt. So Cornelius Vanderbilt was the wealthiest individual in the United States in the mid-19th century. He was a shipping magnate who had made his fortune in the middle of the 1840s and 1850s, had profited handsomely from the Civil War, and had passed on his wealth to his children, including his son, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, whose mansion, as you can see in this image, covered a full square block on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan. So the person he's referring to here are the Vanderbilts, who are sort of the epitome of living in extravagance. So Van Hosen says, "Who is this Vanderbilt that he should pay as much for his breakfast as he pays 10 men for their day's work? We do wish to invite every man who has no capital but his 2 hands to join us." Okay, so think of the emphasis on the 2 hands. It's a reassertion of the older Republican value of labor, that it is work with one's own hands that gives one a claim to citizenship. So the counterpoint to the extreme wealth of Vanderbilt, also in Manhattan, just a few blocks away from this mansion we saw in the previous image, is the extreme poverty of workers, many of them immigrants who are flooding into the United States, especially in New York City, in the late 19th century and early 20th centuries. So This second image is a photograph by Jacob Riis, who was a Danish photographer, journalist, who wrote a book called How the Other Half Lives, which documented the lives of immigrants and the poor in Manhattan at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. And so you can see it's a small family crowded with their life's possessions into a dingy apartment. So people were very much aware of this contrast between the extravagant wealth of Vanderbilt and the dire poverty of workers in the tenements of Manhattan, and the ways in which the existing economic system both created and reinforced that economic divide. So increasingly, the political interests of workers were expressed not in the language of Republican citizenship, but through the power of organized labor. Knowing that the economic machine could not operate without the cooperation of workers, they tried to exact concessions by threatening to withhold their labor if capital did not comply with their demands. One of the key organizations in the 1870s and 1880s in this respect was the Knights of Labor, which were led by Terence Powderly. So the Knights of Labor were originally a kind of fraternal organization that evolved into something much larger, a much larger labor movement. Sometimes this involved supporting strikes, but it also involved a much larger movement, a reformation of society, a revisioning of how people might live. And so Powderly and the Knights of Labor believed in the unity of all workers, that workers, whether they were skilled or unskilled, whether they were male or female, whether they were black or white, all had a common interest, a shared interest as laborers. And Powderly believed that if workers banded together to protect their interests against capital, they could secure a better life with more leisure time and a greater emphasis on education and family life. But he warned that if the holders of capital were not responsive to these demands, they would face dire repercussions. So he wrote in 1890 that the army of the discontented is gathering fresh recruits. Day by day is true. And if this army should become so large that driven to desperation it should one day arise in its wrath and grapple with its real or fancied enemy, the responsibility for that act must fall upon the heads of those who could have averted the blow, but who turned a deaf ear to the supplication of suffering humanity and gave the screw of oppression an extra turn because they had the power. Working men's organizations are doing all they can to avert the blow, but if that day dawns upon us, it will be chargeable directly to men who taunt others with unequal earnings and distort the truth.